The candles in the dining room at Ashford Park had been lit an hour before Cecily reached the bottom of the staircase, and she knew by the warmth in the hall that the household had arranged itself without her. The footman at the dining room door, a young man named Peters who had worked at Ashford Park since before her father took ill, glanced at her with something that was almost apology before he pulled the door open. The room smelled of beeswax and roasted meat, and the particular warmth of a fire built too high for a March evening. Cecily stepped inside. Her chair, the chair at the foot of the table where she had sat through 7 years of her father's diminishing health, through 23 winters, and the particular grief of a house rearranging itself around a dying man, was occupied. Her half-sister Philippa sat there, wearing the ivory gown that had been ordered for the season's first formal dinner, her shoulders settled into the chair back with the ease of someone who had been placed there deliberately and told to stay. Lady Maren Hartwell occupied the chair at the table's head, pearls bright at her throat, a composed expression on her face that did not shift when Cecily entered the room. The remaining seat, the one placed just to the left of the table's midpoint where a visiting guest would ordinarily sit, was the only one empty. It had been given a place card. Cecily could read her own name on it from across the room. She did not move toward it immediately. She stood at the door while her mind registered what her face was determined not to show. The room held 6 people besides herself, including Mr. Doyle the solicitor, who had come up from London the day before, and whose presence at a family dinner suggested something had been decided or was about to be. Then the man to Mr. Doyle's left pushed back his chair. He stood without announcement, without ceremony, without addressing anyone in particular. He was perhaps 35 years old, broad-shouldered, with the sort of quietness that sometimes belongs to men who are accustomed to a room going still when they enter it. He picked up the place card that bore his name, and he carried it to the midpoint seat, the seat that bore hers. He set his card in that position, collected her card in the same motion, and carried it to the foot of the table, where he placed it against the base of her water glass and drew back the chair. He did not look at Lady Maren. He looked at Cecily. He said, without inflection and without apology, "Miss Hartwell, your seat, I believe." The dining room at Ashford Park had not been so quiet since her father's funeral. What Cecily felt in that moment was something she would not have trusted herself to name. She crossed the room. She took the seat he had returned to her, and she looked down at her plate so that no one could read her face. She did not yet know this man's name. She did not yet understand what he intended. But she felt, in the pit of her chest, the way a held breath finally releases. Her name was Cecily Hartwell, and she was 23 years old, and until 14 months ago, this house had been the only world she had ever trusted. Her father, Sir Edmund Hartwell, had been a man of particular warmth and moderate organization. He had inherited Ashford Park, 300 acres of south-facing Kent farmland, and the kind of easy county standing that requires very little maintenance as long as a man does not live beyond £4,000 a year. He had managed this for some time. Then he had married Lady Maren Covington, a widow from a good Somerset family with a daughter of her own, and the household had shifted in the quiet, persistent way of a river that changes its course before anyone marks the new bank. Maren had not been unkind to Cecily. She had simply been organized, in the way that certain women are organized, around a specific understanding of who matters and who is useful. After Sir Edmund's death, 14 months before the dinner at which a stranger stood and gave Cecily her seat back, the household had reorganized with greater efficiency. Cecily was given charge of the household accounts. She managed the kitchen orders, the correspondence with the estate's 2 tenant farmers, the scheduling of the household staff, and the arrangement of every room that guests would see. She did this without salary and without acknowledgement, and the word her stepmother most frequently used when describing her function to visitors was indispensable, which Cecily had come to understand as a word that meant the same thing as invisible. She was not invited to the first London dinner party Lady Marin attended after Sir Edmund's death. She was invited to the second, only because the numbers required a fourth woman. She sat between a young clergyman with clammy hands and a retired colonel who spent the meal addressing her stepmother, and she observed the room with the patience she had developed over years of learning which spaces in a house were hers and which she merely maintained. The first time her stepmother used the word that became the label Cecily carried through that spring, it was at a morning call with two women from the neighboring estate, and Cecily was in the adjacent room going over the week's linen count. She was not intended to hear it, but the door was thin. "Cecily manages beautifully," Lady Marin said, in the tone of someone describing a well-trained animal. "But she has very little to recommend her to anyone of consequence." Poor child. She has inherited her father's warm heart, and not one of her mother's advantages. She will be a great comfort to us in the country, and nothing at all in a drawing room. Poor child. Cecily set down the linen ledger and did not move for approximately 30 seconds. She heard it again 6 weeks later at a garden party at the Fairweather estate, where Lady Marin was explaining to Mrs. Fairweather the difficulty of the past year. "One does what one can for a girl in her situation," she said. "No portion, no connections of her own, no particular accomplishment. Poor child. One hopes she will attach herself to something useful before the county stops pretending to consider her." The third time, Cecily was present when it was said. That occasion came later, and it arrived with greater weight. Andrew Ericsson had come to London 4 months before the dinner at Ashford Park, arriving from Copenhagen by way of Amsterdam with a cargo enterprise behind him, and a letter of introduction to 3 men in the city, whose opinions of him apparently mattered enough to produce dinner invitations from families who would not ordinarily have opened their drawing rooms to a man without a title. He was not a gentleman by birth. He was, by the clear-eyed accounting of the class machinery that governed English social life, exactly the sort of man whom one might seat at the left of a solicitor at a family dinner as a gesture toward the commercial relationships one wished to maintain. He had accepted Lady Marin's dinner invitation because Mr. Doyle had asked him to, and because he had his own reasons for wishing to observe how the Hartwell estate's affairs were being managed. He had not expected the woman with the place card and the careful face. Cecily did not immediately understand what he observed in her, because she was occupied in the weeks that followed with not understanding what he observed in her. He came to Ashford Park 3 times in April. The first visit was transactional, an afternoon with Mr. Doyle in her father's old study. The second was for an apparently social reason that Cecily could not quite parse, since he had no particular friendship with anyone in the household she could identify. The third time, he arrived on a Tuesday morning when the household was in the ordinary state of a house being managed rather than displayed, and he found Cecily in the kitchen passage with the cook, Mrs. Webb, going over the week's accounts. He was offered the drawing room. He waited in the kitchen passage instead, standing against the wall with his hat in his hands, and when Cecily looked up from the ledger and found him there, she did not apologize for her surroundings. She said, "Mr. Ericsson," which was the extent of her acknowledgement, and returned to the column she was completing. "You've shorted the household accounts by £4, he said after a moment. "I am aware," she said. "I have moved £4 to the stable account, without my stepmother's knowledge, because the hay delivery was 2 weeks past due, and the man would not wait. I intend to rebalance the accounts at the end of the month, when the tenant payment arrives." He said nothing. She looked up. His expression, which had previously been the kind of still she associated with a man who had trained himself not to show his work, had shifted by something small but legible. Not admiration, exactly. Recognition, perhaps. The quality of a man who has just heard something he expected to hear and is more relieved than he thought he would be. Cecily looked back at the ledger. She did not trust that expression. She had spent too many months being useful in ways that cost her something to trust the reactions of people who had cost her nothing yet. The witnessing she did not know she had earned came a week later. She had been in the south corridor of the house when she heard her stepmother's voice from the drawing room, carrying the particular edge it acquired when something had been decided. Cecily came to the drawing room door and stood in the hall. And through the open door she saw Lady Maren seated at the writing desk, Philippa standing at her elbow with a look of satisfied attention, and Nora standing before them with her hands folded at her waist. Nora was 61 years old and had been at Ashford Park since before Cecily's birth. She had dressed Cecily for her first London visit when Cecily was 16. She had brought broth to the sick room every morning of Sir Edmund's final winter. Lady Maren was dismissing her. The reason given was economy. The word used was redundant. The expression on Philippa's face was the expression of someone who had suggested the decision and was gratified to see it enacted. Cecily walked into the room. She said, "I beg your pardon, Lady Maren, but I must disagree." The courtesy was a shell around something considerably less courteous. "Nora's position is funded from the household account I manage. I have not approved this dismissal, and I do not intend to." Lady Maren looked at her for a moment in the way she reserved for statements she found both inconvenient and slightly interesting. "You do not manage this household, Cecily. I manage the household accounts," Cecily said. "The distinction matters. Nora stays." Philippa made a sound. Nora looked at Cecily with an expression that contained several years of gratitude and one very precise kind of grief. The grief of someone who knows they will not always be saved. Lady Maren said, after a measured pause, "We will discuss this later." It was not a victory. But Nora did not leave that week, and the dismissal was not raised again while Cecily remained in the house. What Cecily did not know was that Andrew Erickson had come to the south corridor for a book he had left in the library the day before, and that he had stopped in the hall when he heard the voices, and that he had stood at the corridor's end and heard every word. She did not know, because she had not looked toward the corridor's end when she left the room. She had been too busy making certain her face did not show what that confrontation had cost her. He said nothing to her about it that day. He made no reference to it the following afternoon, when they happened to meet in the garden, where she had gone to read the letter from the estate's eastern tenant in the only 20 minutes of the day that were reliably hers. He sat down on the stone bench at the garden's far end without invitation and looked at the kitchen garden wall for a while, and eventually he said, "Your father left a codicil." Cecily looked at him. "Mr. Doyle mentioned my father's will to you?" "Mr. Doyle mentioned it to me in the context of a business arrangement your stepmother has been attempting to conduct," he said. "One that would require the codicil to have been lost." The word "lost" arrived in her chest like a stone dropped into cold water. She felt the ripple of it, the way it spread outward and touched everything. "I see," she said. He looked at her then, fully and without the usual discipline of his face, and she saw something in his expression that she was not equipped to read correctly. She categorized it as pity. She filed it in the same ledger where she kept all the other small costs of her particular season, and she looked back at the tenant's letter. What it was not was pity. He had been married once, in Denmark, to a woman named Astrid, the daughter of a merchant family with whom his own family had long-standing arrangements. He had cared for Astrid in the specific way of a young man who respects what he has been given and does not yet know the difference between care and love. He had been 27 years old and occupied with building a business, and Astrid had been quiet and patient, and had not told him that she was unhappy until there was nothing useful that could be said. She had died of a fever in the winter of their 4th year together. He had stood at her bedside and known, with the clarity of a man who had arrived too late to fix what he had spent 4 years not seeing, that he had chosen correctly by every available standard and wrongly by every other one. He had sworn, in the particular silence of that Danish winter, that he would not repeat that calculation. He would not again look at a woman's situation and fail to look at the woman herself. He watched Cecily Hartwell read the tenant's letter in the garden with the focused efficiency of someone who had not been given the option of being otherwise, and he was careful not to let his expression say what it was doing. He was not entirely successful. In the days that followed, the household at Ashford Park existed in a state that Cecily recognized as the particular calm before the machinery of consequence finishes assembling itself. She felt it in the way her stepmother's courtesy acquired a new temperature, polished and regular, like the surface of ice that has not yet finished forming. She felt it in the way Philippa had begun speaking about the estate's summer arrangements in the future tense, using the word "our" in reference to rooms and grounds and plans for improvements in the East Wing. She felt it in the way Mr. Doyle had twice sent word that he would call, and twice postponed. She was going over the kitchen accounts one morning, sitting at the plain deal table in the room adjacent to the pantry, because all the better writing surfaces in the house had been claimed, when Philippa came in without knocking. This was not unusual. Philippa had the habit of entering rooms as though her entry constituted permission. She sat down across from Cecily and arranged her skirts with the deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed what she is about to say. "You know," she said, "that the estate cannot accommodate 2 women indefinitely. Lady Marin has made arrangements. You would have a comfortable situation in Bath. There is a family there who requires a companion for an elderly aunt." Cecily did not look up from the accounts. "A companion," she said. "It is a respectable position," Philippa said. "It is very kind of Lady Marin to think of my respectability," Cecily said, "while arranging to remove me from my own house." Philippa's expression shifted by a degree. "Poor girl," she said, and the words had clearly been given to her, the same way the ivory gown and the arrangement at the dinner had been given to her. "You have made this very difficult for yourself. If Father had simply provided for you more clearly." Cecily set down her pen. She looked at her half-sister, who was 2 years younger and had never, in all those 2 years, been required to be useful. "He did provide for me clearly," she said. "You should ask Mr. Doyle what he has been asked to lose." That evening, the letter arrived. It was addressed to her in Mr. Doyle's hand, and it was short. He had been instructed by Lady Marin to confirm to Cecily that the codicil to Sir Edmund's will, the document dated 14 months ago, that designated the unentailed portion of Ashford Park and its annual income of £4,000 to Sir Edmund's elder daughter, had been mislaid in the course of the estate's administration. Without the original document, he wrote, he could not in good conscience present it for probate. He was very sorry. He hoped she understood the position in which this placed him. Cecily read the letter at the deal table in the pantry room, with the candle burning low and the house quiet around her, and the sound of her own breathing the only thing she could hear for a full minute. She understood, with a precision that was almost cold, that this was what destruction looked like when it wore a legal face. She also understood, equally precisely, what she intended to do about it. There is a moment in every woman's life, at least in the life of a woman who has spent years being patient, in a situation that required patience. When the patience runs out, and what is left is not anger exactly, but something cleaner and more deliberate. Cecily had reached that moment at the pantry deal table, in the candle's last quarter hour of light, and what she decided was not dramatic and not loud. She folded Mr. Doyle's letter. She put it in her pocket. She went to bed. In the morning, she sent a note to Mr. Doyle at the inn in the village where he was staying, and she asked him to meet her in the garden at 9 o'clock before the household was fully assembled. She wrote 3 sentences. The first named the date on which her father had asked her to witness the codicil signing. The second named the second witness, a man from the village who had been her father's steward for 11 years and who was still alive. The third asked Mr. Doyle whether a witnessed and dated document of which he had personal knowledge could be truly lost, or only mislaid by people who wished it to be. Mr. Doyle appeared in the garden at 5 minutes past 9. He had the expression of a man who has been hoping to avoid a conversation and has just understood that it is going to happen anyway. He sat on the stone bench, turned his hat in his hands, and said, "Miss Hartwell." "You have the original," she said. Not a question. He was quiet for a moment. "I was placed in a position," he said. "Yes," she said. "I understand what position you were placed in. I am asking you to leave that position and stand in your own." Another silence. A longer one this time. Then he said, "The formal dinner this Friday. Lady Marin has invited half the county. Mr. Erickson has been asked to attend, I believe because she intends to make the estate's revised arrangements publicly known at that occasion." He turned the hat again. If the original document were presented at that occasion, in the presence of those witnesses, it would be considerably more difficult for anyone to mislay it afterward. "Yes," Cecily said. "It would." He looked at her for a moment, and in his face she saw the precise shape of a man who has been uncomfortable with himself for 14 months, and is grateful to be given a reason to stop. She had not planned to tell Andrew any of this. He found her in the garden afterward, in the particular way he had of appearing in spaces she occupied, as if the house arranged itself to produce these meetings. He stood at the garden gate and looked at her, and she found that she was too tired to maintain the distance she had been keeping. "Mr. Doyle will attend the dinner," she said. "He has something that belongs to me." Andrew did not ask how she had accomplished this. He said, "Are you all right?" It was such a simple question, and it had been so long since anyone in this house had asked it, that she had to look away for a moment. She looked at the kitchen garden wall, at the first suggestion of spring green in the ivy, at the way the morning light came over the east wing roof. She said, "I will be." He said, "I know." His expression in that moment was not careful at all. The formal dinner on Friday evening was the largest the house had hosted since her father's last good winter. Lady Marin had arranged it with the thoroughness of a woman who intends an announcement and wants the audience properly assembled. The Fairweather family came. The Aldridge family came. Reverend Caxton and his wife came. Several people Cecily did not recognize. Friends of Philippa's from London came. Nora stood at her post near the drawing-room door and watched the room with the particular attention of someone who knows the furniture, but not the play. Cecily dressed without assistance in the room she had been given, the small room at the north end of the house that faced the stable yard, in the blue-gray gown that was 3 seasons old and had been let out once at the seams. She looked at herself in the glass for a moment, and then she looked away, because the exercise of examining herself was one she had learned to restrict to necessary occasions. She pinned her hair without a lady's maid and went downstairs. and she was at the foot of the staircase when Andrew appeared from the direction of the library and saw her in the hall. He looked at her for a moment in the plain light of the corridor, without ceremony, and then he offered his arm. She took it, because the dining room door was ahead of them, and because his arm was there, and because some costs are worth bearing. The dinner was arranged with Cecily between Mr. Doyle and Mrs. Fairweather, which was not the foot of the table and not the midpoint seat, but was at least a position of some visibility. Lady Maren sat at the head, and Philippa sat at her right hand, and Andrew sat 4 places down the table, in the position of a commercial acquaintance, which was what he was to everyone in the room except Cecily and possibly Mr. Doyle. The soup course passed. The fish course passed. Lady Maren kept up the smooth, consistent warmth of a woman who has arranged things to her satisfaction and is enjoying the arrangements. She spoke to the Fairweathers about the season. She spoke to the Aldridges about Philippa's coming out. She spoke once, across the table to no one in particular, about the necessity of establishing clear lines of inheritance in estates that had suffered from inattention. The word inattention arrived in the room and settled on the table like a piece of flatware placed with deliberate emphasis. Cecily looked at her plate. Then Lady Maren said, in the measured, carrying voice of someone who has chosen her moment, "It is a particular relief to have the estate's affairs settled at last. Poor Cecily has been so devoted to the household, and we are all so grateful. But it would be unkind to ask her to remain in a position that can no longer offer her the establishment she deserves. She has had a very difficult year." She looked down the table at Cecily with an expression of composed sympathy that was the most socially devastating thing Cecily had ever had directed at her face. Poor girl. The room's murmur continued for a moment around this, the sound of guests processing the information they had been given and settling into the version of events they had been offered. Mr. Doyle set down his wineglass. He said in his precise solicitor's voice, addressing no one in particular, and the entire table simultaneously, "Before the estate's affairs are considered fully settled, I am obliged to note that I am in possession of a document that has a material bearing on those affairs." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper sealed with a notary's mark. The codicil to Sir Edmund Hartwell's will, dated 11 months before his death, witnessed by myself and by Mr. Samuel Grange of Hartwell Village, in which Sir Edmund designated the unentailed income of Ashford Park, £4,000 annually, to his elder daughter, Cecily Charlotte Hartwell, with the understanding that she should maintain residence at the estate at her choosing. He set the document on the table beside his plate, with the careful placement of a man who has thought about this gesture for some time. "I am happy to make it available for inspection by any guest who wishes to see it." The murmur this time was a different kind. It had an edge. Lady Maren had gone very still. Philippa looked at her mother. Andrew Erickson pushed back his chair. He stood, as he had stood at the dinner 4 months ago in this same room, without announcement, without ceremony, without addressing anyone in particular. He walked around the table. The room watched him walk. He walked with the unhurried directness of a man who has decided what he is going to do and does not require the room's permission to do it. He walked to where Cecily sat, and he stopped behind her chair. And he looked at the assembled company of the Fairweathers and the Aldridges, and the Reverend and his wife, and the London friends and the Hartwell household. And he said, in a voice that was level and clear and utterly irrevocable, "Miss Hartwell is the mistress of this house. She has managed it, maintained it, and defended it for 14 months. I have had the privilege of observing this. I intend, if she will permit me, to have considerably more than that privilege, for considerably longer." He looked at Cecily. Cecily looked up at him from her chair. She had managed, throughout the dinner, to be still and composed, and to eat a reasonable amount, and to respond appropriately to Mrs. Fairweather's conversational efforts. She had not managed to be still now. She felt the warmth in her face, and the precise, almost painful sensation in her chest that comes from being seen by someone who has earned the right to see you. And she looked at Andrew Erickson, and understood, at last, what his expressions had been doing for the past 4 months. She said, "I believe, Mr. Erickson, that the privilege you describe might be arranged." The room released a breath it had been holding for approximately 3 minutes. At the head of the table, Lady Marin's composure, which had been the finest instrument of social management Cecily had ever been subject to, showed its first visible fracture. It was not a collapse in the theatrical sense. It was the specific, very quiet deflation of a confidence that has been organized around a set of arrangements, when those arrangements dissolve. She sat at the head of the table, and she looked at the codicil on the white cloth, and she looked at the faces of the Fairweathers and the Aldridges, who were not looking at her. And she said nothing, because for perhaps the first time in 14 months, there was nothing in her register that was equal to what was required. Philippa set down her fork. She looked at Andrew, and then at Cecily, and in her face was something that was not quite recognition, and not quite guilt, but was in the general territory of both. She did not speak for the remainder of the dinner. Nora, standing at her post near the drawing-room door, looked across the dining room at Cecily, with an expression that required no translation at all. Mr. Fairweather asked to see the codicil. Mr. Aldridge's wife leaned toward her husband and said something low. The Reverend Caxton looked pleased in the specific way of a clergyman who has witnessed the eventual operation of a principle he has long trusted. The dinner continued. The evening continued. Lady Marin found, over the course of the 2 hours that followed, that the room arranged itself away from her, not with hostility, but with the quiet gravitational shift of a room that has received new information and is redistributing its attention accordingly. She departed early, citing a headache with Philippa at her arm. The house, for the first time in 14 months, breathed differently. In the days that followed the formal dinner, there were letters. There were appointments with Mr. Doyle. There were practical arrangements of the kind that arrive when a document is taken out of a solicitor's coat and placed on a table in front of witnesses. Lady Marin confirmed to Mr. Doyle that she and Philippa would withdraw to her property in Somerset. She did this with a dignity that was genuine and that Cecily found, unexpectedly, that she could respect. There had been no malice in the woman's machinery, only the specific ruthlessness of a person whose world is organized around survival, and who had done what her world had taught her to do. Andrew came to the garden the morning after the dinner, and sat on the stone bench and did not look at the kitchen garden wall this time. He looked at Cecily. She looked at him, and the long practice of not trusting what she read in other people's expressions began, very slowly, to lose its hold on her. He said, "I should tell you that my intentions, when I came to Ashford Park, were not what they became." "I know," she said. "I came because Mr. Doyle asked me to witness the state of the estate's management," he said. "I stayed because you shorted the kitchen accounts by £4 and intended to rebalance them with the tenant payment." She looked at him. He looked almost, in that precise moment, something approaching amused, which was such a rare quality in his face that she registered it as a significant event. "That is a very specific reason," she said. "You are a very specific person," he said. "I have not always been good at seeing specific people." There was a silence that held between them the weight of his dead wife and her dispossession, and the 14 months of managing a house that was not supposed to be hers to manage, and she sat with all of that, and found that it was bearable, because he was sitting with it too. By May, Andrew had proposed. By June, the estate's affairs were arranged as her father had intended. By the late summer, she was Cecily Erickson, which was a name she had not expected to carry, and which fitted her, she found, with the ease of something made for its purpose. Winter came to Ashford Park with the particular gentleness that some winters have, the snow arriving in the first week of December and lying over the fields in an unbroken white that made the estate look like something imagined rather than something maintained. Cecily stood at the library window on a Thursday afternoon with a cup of tea in her hands and watched the snow cover the kitchen garden wall and settle in the branches of the oak at the east end of the park. And she felt the house around her the way she had felt it when she was a child, not as a problem or a responsibility, but as a place that was hers. The fire in the library was built higher than was strictly necessary, and the room smelled of books and wood smoke and the particular warmth of a house that is inhabited rather than administered. Andrew was at the desk across the room, going over the estate accounts with the focused attention he brought to numbers, and occasionally he looked up and looked at her in the way he had been looking at her since that dinner in March, with the quality of a man who has decided to see a person and intends to continue. Nora had brought the tea without being asked. She had also brought a plate of biscuits, because she was Nora, and the establishment of warmth in a room was something she considered a professional obligation. She had looked at Cecily when she set the tray down, and her expression had contained, as always, several years, and one very precise kind of satisfaction. From somewhere in the house, Philippa's old pianoforte was sounding. The previous occupant of the room had left the instrument behind, and Cecily had found, in the weeks since the house became hers, that she could not quite bring herself to move it. She had begun to play it again in the evenings, in the way she had played it before her father's illness, for no one in particular, and for the sound itself. The snow came down past the library window, and Andrew looked up from the accounts, and Cecily looked away from the garden and looked at him instead, and the pianoforte was quiet somewhere in the house, and the fire burned, and Ashford Park held them both. She was home. If Cecily's story touched something in you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that landed. Stories like this one survive because people carry them forward, and there are more waiting whenever you are ready.